Let's call the meeting to order. It's 6:02 and a half or something like that. And Pam, could we get a roll call?
All right. And we'll start with Bill Infante.
Here.
Katie Schwer. Here. Auden Chandler.
Here.
Jennifer Riffle. Present. Ryan Slack.
Here.
Jackie Wilson. Here. And Gary Tenney. Absent.
Thank you so much. Okay, we want to thank Grassroots, as always, for being here to broadcast our meeting live. And also, you can watch it later in your spare time at grassrootstv.org. Our videographer is the other Ryan O'Connell. I'm assuming they're all Irish. Would be my guess? No? The Mayor's Coffee is tomorrow at 8 o'clock to 8:30 at CC's across the street. And if you show up to chat with me and or Ryan Mahoney, I will buy your coffee. And why don't we ask Bill Infante if he would read the Basalt as an inclusive?
Shall do. Okay. For all. Basalt is an inclusive, sustainable mountain community that boasts both historic charm and progressive vision. It's an engaging place to live, work, and play while offering an abundance of creative, professional, educational, and recreational outlets.
Nice job,
There you go.
Mr. Infante. Okay, the consent agenda has got the minutes and a couple other kind of housekeeping type things, National Night Out and the Market Street Block Party. Is there a motion or questions regarding the consent agenda?
Just have one quick word change. In the discussion of Tabor, Bill says that he heard that town would have. No, we were advised by our lawyer and Tabor expert. I didn't hear it.
Can you say where that is?
Sure.
Okay,
Page
Pam's
4,
looking.
second paragraph, second line. This is in the minutes, yeah.
Thank you. And you said page 4?
Page 4, para 2, line 2, middle, it says, Bill said, however, that he heard. No, Bill said, however, that we were advised by our lawyer and Tabor expert.
So we were advised.
All right.
Okay, I will get that corrected for you.
So who made that motion?
Thank you millions.
No one's.
Has anybody made a motion?
No.
Okay, when we make it, could we make it as corrected?
Mayor, I move the town council approve the consent agenda items as corrected by Mr. Infante.
Is there a second?
I have to second that.
All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Aye.
Thank you.
Thank you. At this point, we would invite members of the public to come up and make comments of approximately 3 minutes for items that are not on the agenda. Is there anyone in the audience who would like to make a comment for an item not on the agenda? Okay, hearing none. The next item is mayor and council reports and comments, and you look like you've got something.
I would just like to let everyone know that the Rudeye Water Power Authority, which we help sponsor along with many other of the communities and counties around us, help support the ANS, the aquatic nuisance species decontamination of boats going up to Rudeye. We have now found 6 boats, which is, I think, triple last year of the whole year.
Wow.
So the program's working and it's protecting Rudeye, and it's great.
Thank you for that,
No problem.
because we didn't really hear too much about that before. I hope this isn't going to keep going.
Oh, it's probably gonna keep going.
No, it didn't.
Oh, that probably won't go. But the ANS will continue to go because it's,
Yes.
yeah, it seems like a lot of boats are coming
Other?
from Powell. So.
Katie?
I would like to ask the council and the town of Basalt to join over 750 local governments in 16 countries in declaring a climate emergency in response to our current climate crisis. Right now, like I mentioned, there's 16 countries, 744 local governments, 19 in the US. The majority are in California, 14 of the 19. We would join New York City with a population of about 8.4 million, all the way down to Crystal Bay, Minnesota, that has a population of 607. And so declaring a climate emergency has been proposed in the US Senate and the US House. And I'm gonna read part of that resolution that came from the Senate. And it was the global warming caused by human activities, which increase emissions of greenhouse gases, has resulted in a climate emergency that demands a national, social, industrial, and economic mobilization of the resources and labor of the United States at a massive scale to halt, reverse, mitigate, and prepare for the consequences of the climate emergency and to restore the climate for future generations. We are hitting 500 parts per million. We know that Alaska's temperatures this year have hit 100. We know that last year we endured a fire that is undeniably related to climate. And what this would do, I have a resolution draft, what this would do is set the tone of the town and our government to make climate action our first and foremost priority. And again, set the groundwork to let our communities know, our Basalt community, town of Aspen or city of Aspen, counties, our state and our national governments know that this is the greatest challenge that human civilization has ever encountered, and we must act immediately. So this resolution, which I would hand over to town staff to change to be relevant to the town of Basalt, but the title of it is Resolution Endorsing the Declaration of a Climate Emergency and Requesting Regional Collaboration on an Immediate Just Transition and Emergency Mobilization Effort to Restore a Safe Climate. So again, we're not the first. We would be the 20th in our country. We'd be the first in the state of Colorado. And I feel like I can't imagine why we would not do this. It is purely just establishing our priorities and then allowing us to move forward on action that matters.
So are you asking council to support putting it on the agenda for the
Yes,
next future,
unless,
I'll just say future meeting to work around
someone
this?
wants to say we're doing it, but we don't have an actual resolution to adopt tonight.
Okay, yeah,
I'd like to support it and then build on it. So 100% support it. You know, the other thing this would do is provide leadership for future councils and just put a stake in the ground and bring attention to the issue. But another thing that I think the town ought to do, and I think we ought to do it now, is we ought to put a ballot question on the next ballot that asks if the community would be willing to switch all households to renewable power through Holy Cross Energy. This would make us, there are not that many towns or cities that have done this. It would make us one of the top, first 10 to do this. It would highlight the issue. It would support Holy Cross Energy in its efforts. The cost per individual, the average monthly usage in Basalt is 1,130 kilowatt hours, so it'd be about $9 a month more. The worst case scenario would be $14 more, slightly more than that. But the interesting point is that Holy Cross is making huge progress on renewable power. So as their renewable power climbs, the premium declines, and if Holy Cross achieves 100%, the premium goes away. So this would be a cost that naturally sunsets. So I don't know what is the timing for ballot measures to be?
August 27th meeting.
Okay, so I have just a draft of this that if everyone supports this, in addition to what Katie's doing, I think we should go for it. And if people vote it down, great. But this is really important to bring the issue to the fore, to support Holy Cross, and it would put another stake in the ground for Basalt. There's another thing I just want to bring up, which is that we haven't, we've done some climate leadership, but we haven't done really aggressive stuff. And one of the things, as we've discussed, that you can do is you can electrify buildings. And the reason you need to do that is there's no way to heat it other than combusting fossil fuels unless you use renewable energy. The last two big high-profile projects that have come in front of council have been voluntarily electrified. Berkeley, as I understand it, recently said you can't use natural gas in new buildings. We should do that. We should change code and say that all new buildings have to be electric heat. So that's down the line. I'm just floating that as the kind of thing you could do under a climate emergency declaration.
right. Let me ask this. I personally would love to see this go through the green team with, you know, the support of the council, just to take a look at it and maybe come in here and make a presentation, because that was one of the things I talked to Katie about, is that we pass resolutions and things like that all the time, and you never hear about it again. So we need to do something more than that. It's probably something that's gonna take every meeting for the rest of our lives, and not just the meeting that this is on. So we don't have it on the agenda for tonight, and, you know, my only concern with having an in-depth conversation is that people probably want to be here for this conversation. So let's let them know.
And I support the green team reviewing it, but not if it is a time constraint on getting a ballot issue done. So I'd love to see it on the next agenda.
Okay.
And I agree. Time is of the essence. Like, there's no greater crisis with a shorter time frame than this.
Bill?
I'm with Katie on this. Insofar as the resolution goes, I would love to see us adopt this and advance it and express our commitment to fighting climate change, and to do it as soon as possible.
Anybody else on this one? Is anybody against us bringing this back onto the agenda?
I'm fully in support of
Okay, me
both
too.
Katie and
Both?
Auden's proposal.
Sure.
I got one more thing.
Sure,
Sorry, I've got a lot here tonight.
you've been saving it up.
Yeah, the other thing I wanted to bring up, right now, the play park, the kayak play park is doing the opposite of what we hoped it would do. It's keeping people away. People are scared of it for good reason. And what I would love to do is communicate from the town to Pickens County saying, you know, we'd love to help, even financially, to some extent, improve that this fall. It's gonna take some substantial revisions, and I would love to ask them to use a different firm. And I shared with you a name, Mike Harvey and Scott Shipley are two people who can improve that wave. But the reason I think it's worth an investment by the town is that if it were working, it would be bringing in revenue. And if you've been to Eagle, there's a wave and it's just packed. You know, it's same as Glenwood. So what we want is a wave, not a hole. And it's dangerous now, but it could be this incredible thing. And this is, you know, this is not to cast aspersions on the project at all. These things are iterative and it takes time, but I think we just want to get in front of Pickens County. The other thing is there's a whole community of boaters that wants to weigh in, Ryan, and who do you think the best people for them? Is it John Peacock or?
No, so Lisa McDonald is the project lead on this, and we've shared with her and John Ely, who the project's based out of the attorney's office, like pretty much verbatim what you had just shared. And they do intend to go back in there this winter. That's when they're able. They have permits through the Corps, and there's time frames on those permits, so it won't be this fall. It'll be during the winter when I think it's a fish spawning issue. And they're planning on fixing it. They're planning on getting a second opinion, and they're planning on engaging the community more, not just boaters, but others as well.
And I have one short last thing, just ticking all these agenda items off. The other thing that's been concerning me is the deadness of the ex-Clark's Market parcel. And I plan to try to engage the owners or managers of that parcel to do something, but I just want to get on the record and publicly say, I think we're open to doing something with that parcel. We'd love to see something happen, and right now it's not helping downtown business and vibrancy.
Anybody else? Yes, ma'am?
Just to put it out there to Auden, I'm on board with you with the Whitewater Park. I brought the same subject up. I think it wasn't the last meeting, but the meeting before, with the same exact points. And so I do look forward to collaborating. I see that it's on the agenda for September 9th or so.
The second meeting.
Yeah, the second meeting in September. But I think what we want to, Auden and I are bringing this up because it is very important, and just for it to be known that there is a method for it to get to Pickens County. And then the other part is I do a gratitude every time, and this time is to Eagle County, our other partner, seeing the wildfire mitigation debris flow mitigation that they're completing right now. They have 4 huge machines on Basalt Mountain that are moving earth, making a check dam, and it's a huge project. It's very impressive, and I'm grateful that it's getting done now.
Good one.
Do you have anything, Ryan?
Okay, I just wanted to say yahoo to the volunteers who put on Basalsa. It was a great event. It's kind of almost like the first year because it's been so long since we did it. So there was a good turnout, and I hope we can ramp it up and make it look a little more diverse next time. That would be awesome. And secondly, I was in an opioid conversation yesterday at the library with mostly clinicians, and there was a Basalt police lieutenant there, but mostly it was clinicians. And during the break, a couple of clinicians from the Hope Center came up to me and said that they were so happy about the fact that our Basalt police force is so kind to the homeless people here. They both worked a lot in other communities and said you just don't see that, and I see it all the time, and if you don't appreciate that, please appreciate that, because it's super meaningful. It says everything about your community, about how you treat the very, very downtrodden. So I just wanted to shout out to the Basalt Police Force on that. Okay, manager's report. That would be Ryan Mahoney.
Yeah, so I've got 3 items. You'll have to remind me of the 4th when I get to it. So the first is a request for a letter of support for the solar project that is being proposed up Valley. And we have a draft letter in your packet that actually mirrors a letter that we had gotten our hands on from Snowmass Village. But wanted to just kind of put that out there to see. Katie, once again, had asked if we had some interest in sending them a letter, and so I thought it would be appropriate for us to bring that here and just kind of get input and direction for me if we wanted to forward that on to the Planning and Zoning Commission for Pekin County.
Comments?
Thumbs up. Yep,
Yeah.
thumbs up,
It'd be
well-written
grateful
letter.
for us to send it on.
Yeah.
The next meeting's August 5th.
You need a
think.
motion?
I have a different thought about this. I am totally in support of it, but this is a road that we have all elected officials basically try not to go down, which is to say, you know, Pekin County, we want you to approve this, or Basalt, we want you to approve this or deny this. We try not to go down that road. My thought is that as much as I do support the project, I personally don't think we should weigh in. I think that there seems to be a consensus, or looking like mostly consensus, but I just want you to know that this is opening a door, and you just need to be aware that this is going to probably happen again, and we have to be consistent in how we treat other applications that are going into other people's hands and tables. So I'm going to recuse myself from this and abstain. So if you're going to, and it's also not on the agenda really for people to come and speak about. That's the other thing I have a problem with. I think we should always put things on the agenda if we're going to vote on them, so that people have an opportunity to see that it's on the agenda and that they can come in and make remarks. So we didn't do that either.
It is on the agenda though, isn't it?
It's in the manager's report.
Okay.
So that is not necessarily an action item, which I think it should always be an action item if we're going to vote. I think we're going down a very weird road here, but having said that, whoever is going to move
I would
this forward-
suggest then, if there's, it's not unanimous support for this, that there be a motion to approve, or a motion in relation to the letter of support for the solar
Yeah,
project.
that's what I'm asking for.
And Jackie, I just want to acknowledge all those seem legitimate to me, all your concerns. However, because of the timing and because I do see this as an enormous crisis, I'm going to make a motion that we send the letter. as written.
Second.
Let's say tie goes to Katie on the
Short letter.
second. Further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? I'm not really opposed, I'm a abstain. Okay,
Okay, so the second item is bringing back a letter of support for TACA that TACA could use basically for their potential donors, just to show that the town was behind them on their next step, which is to build the contemporary. And so it was asked that I bring it back, so here it is in front of you all. We did have one change to it this afternoon that clarified that TACA, in the second paragraph of the Performing Arts Center and TACA is in discussions with CORE and Rocky Mountain Institute to explore net zero solutions, so they don't have a partnership as it stands. And I think with Holy Cross was another clarification, so we X'd that. So.
I will say the same thing on this that I said on the last one, which is it's not on the agenda. There's no way for people to come in and comment on it, and we're asking for a vote here. I also would say that as much as I support TACA, and they all know that completely, I feel like we have taken action to show our support by providing land and a commitment to a very large piece of money to help them move forward. I think this is inappropriate. Again, I can imagine having other nonprofits line up for us to write letters to their donors, so I'm going to abstain from this one as well. Don't think we should be voting on things that are not on the agenda. I would listen for
I guess
a
my only
motion.
concern is, again, that all nonprofits come to us with an endorsement, and I just don't wanna get into that. Would be my only concern with this letter. Otherwise, I mean, I think sometimes actions are louder than words, and our actions have been very clear that we're in support of TACA, so.
I think if we were making a public policy decision, it absolutely needs public comment, but to me, this reflects our previous support, one. Two, if other nonprofits come and we don't want to support them, we don't support them. And then three, my friend was guest bartender at Mezzaluna the other night, and I went there. And there weren't that many people there, and I asked the other bartender what was going on, and he said, TACA's not, the temporary's not there. So it really does help those businesses survive over there. So I support sending this letter. And
Nobody would argue that. I'm just saying, I'm kind of a stickler on how public process should happen, and I don't think this is how it should happen. So was there a motion? Anybody?
Mayor, I would motion that we approve and provide the support to TACA, a very highly esteemed and much trusted partner in promoting arts and culture in Basalt.
second.
Further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed or abstain? I abstain.
I'd like to can I make an additional comment?
Sure.
So, in our process, we are all a voice together, and it takes multiples of us to ask staff to do something. And that was part of our earlier, just for transparency, this was part of our earlier counselor comments section of the meeting. And when the suggestion of the letter of support to TACA was suggested a few meetings ago, I didn't experience that it came from a majority of counselors. And I feel a little bit frustrated that both Auden and I have mentioned the Whitewater Park and how important it is. And in that same meeting, I requested of staff, well, how about we write a letter so that it shows that it is on Basalt's mind of the safety and the economics of the Whitewater Park. And that hasn't turned into a letter. And so I'm the same place of Jackie, of having that consistency of us as a board and how we as a voice work together towards end goals. And so just want to point that out.
if I may.
Or
The
Ryan,
only reason a letter for the Whitewater Park wasn't, I mean, if that was direction, it wasn't because I was blowing you off. I'm sorry, I've got a lot going on, so I can bring that back. I'm happy to bring that back the next meeting, so I'll take the blame on not doing that. However, we certainly have communicated very clearly to Pickens County what our position is, and then also have a meeting set up with their county commissioners. And so we can certainly prepare that letter and have it ready, that you guys can, see it at the next meeting.
this vote is done, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, Jen, I get it, but my sense was that he had already communicated that, so I don't need a letter. But I think we've been pretty clear with Pickens County that.
And to comment on the Whitewater Park, it was brought up at the RWAPA meeting. Greg Pushman has said, yes, Pickens County knows it's an issue. They've already been talking to the contractors. It's a 5-year deal or a 5-year contract, with them to continually fix it until everyone's happy. So.
Yeah, and I'm not stuck, by no means am I stuck on the Whitewater Park. I just want us as a group to have this cohesiveness of how we do the process.
Yeah, and I think Ryan and I have talked a little bit, I think Carbondale had this problem in prior times, and they ended up just saying, if it's kind of an out-of-the-blue thing and you're gonna vote on it, get some consensus from the board, or at least a majority vote, to put it on the agenda, because this is not gonna work for very long, the way this is going down. So if we could just keep that in the back of our minds to bring it forward here in comments, and we can get it on that way versus having it like kind of come in the back door from somebody. So there's another one on, I'm sorry.
I don't think
Yeah, go.
I don't think I have direction on the top.
Yeah.
It was a vote.
Four
Four
to
people
to send.
voted to send.
Sorry, I'm just.
That's why we're here.
It's been a long day. It's like Monday
It's a
again.
group lift.
Did we do DOLA?
Not yet.
Yeah.
Quick point. At the last Northwest COG meeting, there was also a discussion about issuing letters of support on behalf of the board of Northwest COG, because they also got a little bit tied up in the process. I invited John to send us their statement of policy after it's articulated sometime soon, don't know when, because I think it would be worth us stepping back and revisiting our policy. What does it take to issue a letter of support for which variety of things? Things that require fiscal resources, things that don't. Things that are issues of global importance like climate change versus things that are supporting our vested interests, like to call. And so I would just suggest that the letter is on the way, or the resolution or ordinance, whatever they call it at Northwest COG, is on the way, and we can use that as a framework for our own deliberation.
Thank you. Okay. So do we have this DOLA?
Yeah, so this was sort of a last minute piece from DOLA, and of course, I think that was by nobody's fault, but the governor had issued a very short window for a grant, and CORE took the lead on it, and they are going to, you have to have a government agency partner, so Garfield County has agreed to do that. And what they're looking for from us is a general nod of support for their efforts, and essentially, and Susan, I might need your assistance on this a little bit, but they have they're wanting to identify areas within the region where solar installations could be put, anywhere from, I think it was 5 kilowatt to 5 megawatt or something along those lines. And so that they have that inventory, and that, there's sort of ready projects, if you will, so that, we can be competitive in the non-renewables, in the renewables. So they want this, and then there may be, I don't know that we can fully commit to it, but $2,500 support that we would end up putting in the 2020 budget. It wouldn't come in 2019. And so just wanted some direction on that, but we would need to send this letter off. It's just, I think they gave, was it less than a month to turn the application around to the Department of Local Affairs for this grant. So it was fast and furious, and I applaud, CORE for jumping at it.
So is this a commitment to fund?
$2,500?
Yeah,
Okay, and is it budgeted somewhere?
we could find money for it, it's $2,500, so that would be pretty simple if we had to do it this year, but, we would be putting it into next year's
Okay.
budget is when we'd have to do it, so I don't know, Jeff, if you're presupposing the outcome of an ordinance that has a public hearing associated with it, or a budget.
This is just to provide, if I understand right, this is to ask council for direction on supporting a DOLA grant application, correct?
Yeah, and we have a letter here that basically just says that we're committing to the $2,500 match. So we could, you know, it's really restricted funds that we're using, so if we want to commit this year's funds and just carry it over into next year, might be the way to do it.
Run, or somebody?
So, I'm sorry, I haven't seen this. So there need to be a subsequent action of the town in relation to if the grant was approved and/or in relation to the budget. So I don't think that this would have like necessarily the binding effect upon the town.
Okay.
So I think support of the application is fine because there would need to be either, if it relates to that funding, either some sort of subsequent action in relation to either the approval of the award or the related budget item.
So this can just be a vote of support for the
Yeah.
application?
Mm-hmm.
Should we say that?
Yeah, motion,
Mayor, I
Well, you-
move.
right? No
Well-
motions on the rest of them.
Yes, we want a motion, but we'll refine the language to address what Jeff is getting at, but we're kind of supporting the actual letter.
And that is time sensitive?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so how would you word that? Somebody?
Just a motion to authorize sending the letter with an edit by Jeff to address the funding.
Okay.
So moved.
Second?
Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, thank you for
And I've
that.
got one more.
Oh,
And so this is on the event, is that
Roy
right?
for Charity Classic.
Yeah. You wanna just?
Sure. So what we're doing is kind of setting this up for a future meeting, but the subject is really the Roaring Fork Charity Classic, and last year, we had a selection committee that was made up of counselors, Bill Infante, Auden Schindler, Ryan Mahoney, Watkins Folk Gray, and Jeff Hasley from the golf tournament, and then actually Jen Riffle was appointed as an alternate. And they had 6 or 7 applications, had selected response for the 2019 golf tournament. They had that tournament, and the response would like to have that tournament for a second year. We used to give the tournaments out for 2 years. Potentially it wasn't as clear that we were only doing it for 1 year. And what we're recommending is that the selection committee reconvene and weigh in on should we reopen it up because of a large amount of interest in the Roaring Fork Charity Classic, or grant it to response. And then second, to look at the third event that we have at the Roaring Fork Club and kind of how we should deal with that. We have a condition in the Roaring Fork Club approvals that we should be looking at creating kind of a community chest for that third event. So it's really a good opportunity to have, I think, a subcommittee to kind of look at these issues and how we should address the tournament.
Where does this stand right now?
Well, right now, it's in nowhere's land because we haven't granted a 2020 Charity Classic beneficiary of the
Okay,
Classic.
and is this on the agenda? Am I looking at this right
No,
now?
it's,
Okay.
no.
Okay.
And it's really just more direction from the council. Does it work for you guys to kind of reconvene the committee again to discuss how we should approach the Roaring Fork Charity Classic?
And they would bring a recommendation back to council.
Who?
The subcommittee.
Oh, okay, that sounds, I mean, is everybody okay with that?
Do we have a choice? I thought we just convene the committee annually and we review the applicants and we approve or
Well,
reject.
we really didn't convene the committee forever and ever. I guess that's kind of the question of how do you want to move forward?
Well, how
And
does
what-
it get decided then every year?
Well, usually we would take kind of an agenda item to the town council to say, how do you want to handle the Roaring Fork Charity Classic? The reason this kind of came up in terms of the timing is because response was kind of anxious to hear back whether they were going to be granted the
Okay,
charity.
so at one time or another, we would need to convene a group,
Yeah,
whether it's now or later.
right.
So,
I
Yeah.
am very much in favor of reconvening the group. We set a precedent last year. I think we should hold to that precedent, convene again this year. I understand Response's desire to convene this urgently, but their urgency is not our urgency. And trying to convene a subcommittee meeting in the next 3 days of this week before people start traveling doesn't seem plausible. So I would suggest we get together with the committee, Auden, me, Jeff, Ryan, and whomever else, and that we meet as soon as possible after people return, which would be the last week of August.
okay, so, I mean, I didn't hear you say that this was urgent.
They want to know as soon as possible.
Well, I agree with Bill that
Yeah.
we just convene it whenever we convene it, and,
Okay. I think that's enough
yeah,
for me.
okay,
Great.
good.
Great.
Anything else?
Nope, that's it. Thank you. Sorry.
Okey dokey.
Long.
All right, so we have been long-winded so far. So the 2018 audit presentation and motion to accept the 2018 audit. Christy, do you want to kick this off and introduce Paul and company?
Yes. So we have with us tonight from McManus and Associates, Paul Bacchus, who's the lead auditor, and Michael Shervin. Both were part of the audit team. Paul ran the audit team and worked diligently on our first audit. Very much appreciative of all of the work they put in this year and all the great recommendations and improvements that they have helped us to continue to achieve. And in the preparation of this audit report. So I'll let them go ahead and start their presentation as soon as they're ready.
All right, I think we are ready. Thank you. As Christy mentioned, my name is Paul Bacchus. I'm a CPA. I'm from Edwards, Colorado, right down the road. And we're kind of an unusual firm in the fact that we only do financial statement auditing. We don't do any tax work. And Mike is the CPA that was in charge of the engagement this year, although I was heavily involved. And our firm is somewhat unique, and I think we pretty much audit maybe 98% of all the governments in Eagle and Pitkin and Garfield counties, including the counties themselves. I think at last count we were 70 or 80% of the cast members. And what you engaged, if you don't know this, engaged our firm to do is to produce audited financial statements that are materially correct and you can rely on them to make financial decisions. So the first thing I kind of want to explain, because some of this stuff gets a little esoteric and I guess difficult to understand if you're not a financial person, is how do we go about that? So Christy uploaded the data to our website and we pull it into our audit software, and this is actually our audit software. I'm just going to briefly walk you through the process that we undertake. So audits consist of kind of three main areas: planning, fieldwork, and reporting. So this is each section of planning, and I'll just kind of briefly walk through it. We pulled the data in, and we sit down and we go through and run reports that compare your data from this year to years past and to budget. And then we also compare things like, property taxes compared to what you assessed, a bunch of different tests. Based upon that, we put together an audit plan. And we go through, read your minutes. So even though this is your first time meeting me, I feel like I've kind of sat in the room all year long. Reading your minutes, reading your ordinances, resolutions. We go through, we look for things like component units, which are other entities that fall under the umbrella of the town. We met with all your department heads. So as an example, this would be the various departments that we met for the town, trying to understand how do you guys process transactions. So as an example, we met with your rec department and said, okay, how do dollars come in, how do dollars go out? Building and planning, cash disbursements in total, cash receipts, police, muni court, payroll, sales tax, those are all various areas of your financial statement audit. We have to understand what are the internal controls over those specific areas. Once we're kind of done with all that, we put together an audit plan, and for the town is actually a relatively small municipality, and so we chose a balance sheet approach, which is pretty typical for your size entity, and that means we start verifying numbers based upon the balance sheet. So as an example, if your general fund has $5 million in it, or your your financial statements say you have $5 million in it, we go, okay, Christy, show us where the $5 million is at. And so this is an example of your bank statement. So we pulled in your Alpine Bank statement, and you can see you had $2 million on here, and then we went through the bank reconciliation, and what we're looking for is to verify that if your financial statements say you have $2 million in your Alpine Bank account, you actually have $2 million. So we're going through and we're looking at the bank recs throughout the year. We're sending bank confirms to the bank to verify that you actually have that account, there's no liens on it. We look through usually an investment policy, and do your investments follow your investment policy? Do they meet state statute? Are they insured by FDIC insurance or a thing called the Public Deposit Protection Act? And once we're done with that, we feel like we're pretty comfortable with cash and investments, that whatever's on your financial statements is correct. And we kind of work our way down the balance sheet. We do the same thing with your governmental funds. So each of these is a work paper, and then you can see this is the individual that did it and the individual that reviewed it. So as an example, property taxes has seemed to have been a hot topic. So we'll go through and say, okay, what did you certify? Did you collect all that, the property tax at the correct percentage based upon the taxing entity that you're in? And ultimately the goal is to make sure that if somebody owes the town money, that you're actually collecting it, you're billing them, or making sure that deposits that come in get deposited timely and coded to the correct account, so that your water bill or your check for your water bill is going to your account and not your neighbor's. And if you don't pay it, there's a follow-up procedure. So we do that with kind of all your tax revenues, and we do the same thing with your water funds. We go through the capital assets. So when the town undertakes a project, we want to make sure that it gets added to your fixed asset listing, it gets depreciated appropriately. If it impacts your insurance rolls, that it gets added to your insurance. We'll do the same thing with accounts payable. Obviously, when the town writes a check or a wire transfer, we want to make sure it's related to town business, it's appropriate for the taxpayer to undertake, it's budgeted for, it's approved by you as the board, it's paid timely. We kind of hate to see, interest or late fees. Those are all kind of symptoms of other problems. And it's coded correctly so that when we look at your financial statements, or you guys look at a budget actual report, you can look at the repair and maintenance line for town hall and know that, hey, that's repair and maintenance and not payroll or some other item. We go through all your payroll accounts. So as an example, this is a work paper from your quarterly financial statement, and we want to add all those 4 quarters up and say, okay, does that equal your W-2s, your W-3s? Are you filing the correct forms? But ultimately, does what you're reporting to the IRS equal with what you report on your internal financial statements for payroll? The town has a couple different debt obligations. So when debt was issued by the town, debt including CLPs and leases, there was a lot of promises made. Sometimes it's a reserve fund, sometimes it's a debt service coverage ratio, sometimes it's just pure reporting. The town undertook an obligation to make sure that you're producing audited financial statements that are materially correct. Ultimately, the report's going to go to all your bondholders, so we want to make sure that the town followed up on all the promises that were made when that debt was issued. Basalt is kind of interesting from an equity standpoint. So obviously, at its base, when you're looking at equity, you want to make sure you started 2018 with where you ended 2017. But Basalt has an incredibly large amount of restricted funds that I kind of didn't appreciate when I first looked at your financial statements. But as we were preparing the financial statements, it's really apparent. You kind of have two things. One is kind of the overall picture. The other is restricted versus unrestricted, and we'll get into that in a little bit. So we actually spent quite a bit of time looking at how do dollars flow in, and are they going into the correct account as far as restrictions. There's also a lot of other items, like you can see we pulled your debrucing question from 2004, various other ballot questions you've had, your home rule charter, trying to make sure that if there's a requirement out there that you're following it. We spent a lot of time looking through your legal invoices, trying to make sure that if there was an obligation that the town had, or a legal obligation or a legal liability, that we properly record those. I know that this is maybe a somewhat hot topic, but we go through, because we audit so many governments, we kind of keep a compliance checklist of, hey, here's state statutes that require all governments. We have one specific for counties, towns, different ones for property taxes. Let me find, yeah, anybody that collects property taxes. So, you know, like here's a question on, are you subject to the 5.5 limitation, Gallagher, things like that. Here's a question on how you calculate Tabor if you're subject. Here's a question on, has the entity changed its mill levy without a vote of the electorate? Those type of questions. So we're going through specific statutes, and each one references a statute, trying to make sure that if there's something required, the city's following up on it.
Paul, can I ask a question?
Sure.
That form that you were just going through, is that your internal form, or is
Yeah.
that a state?
No, that's well, initially, several years ago, the state auditor listed specific statutes that they wanted covered in the audit, and we kind of took that and then added other items that we frequently see as problems for municipalities. Like, as an example, one of my long-term clients is the town of Granby. I don't know if you remember when the grader ran over town hall. So, you know, they called and they had to run payroll, and the next thing I knew was like, okay, let's start really looking at how is the financial system data backed up. Do we have an offsite backup? So it's kind of a combination of information from the state auditor and then information that we've added. It isn't always statutory. A lot of times it's, how are you backing up your data? Do we have an offsite backup? Do we have data that goes offsite on computers, or do you have people dialing in? Who has offsite access to your data? I don't know, lots of
So,
stuff
but
like
for
that.
instance, the one, of course, I honed in on was, is it a state auditor requirement or a state statute requirement that says auditors need to ask, have you raised the mill without a vote?
No, that's just purely kind of
You're
an
thinking,
internal
okay.
thing
Okay,
that we do. We go through and look at all the journal entries. So obviously when your team is making a journal entry, you want to make sure there's backup for it and it makes sense. So we do a fair amount of testing on that. Once we're kind of all done, we get comfortable with the numbers. Then we put together the actual audited financial statements. And your audited financial statements kind of have a number of different sections, so I'll just briefly walk you through these. So there's, because some are audited and some are not audited in kind of in the packet. So there's an introductory section, which is prepared by Christy and your finance team. And that is kind of what's happening in town that is not audited by us, that's more subjective of nature. Then there's the financial section, which is audited by us, and that's what we're kind of staking our reputation on. And that is covered by an independent auditor's report, which in your case would be referred to as an unmodified opinion. It means you can rely on the financial statements and they are materially correct as presented. And then there's a statistical section, which again is unaudited, and that's, what's the population of town? Is it changing? What's your sales tax over the last couple of years? What's your assessed valuation over the last couple of years? And that, we really don't spend much time on that. That's additionally information that your finance team puts together. So, with that said, what I'm gonna do is kind of focus on this finance section. The town, if you don't like numbers, you probably want to stay in section B. Okay, so that's the management discussion analysis. That's kind of the letter prepared by Christie. It has information in there that is kind of high-level information, charts, graphs. You can see in here she has, oops, I'm sorry, I'm jumping around. She has some charts and graphs like where's fund balance, over time, changes in that, where do revenues come from, where do expenses come from, in charts and graphs. So, but since I'm a numbers guy and it's my presentation, I'm gonna actually jump to page C5. So there used to kind of be a joke every now and then, like, hey, the auditor's here, which set of books did you show them? And the irony in that now is there's actually kind of two sets of books for governments, and they're designed to measure two different things. So the first is, how much money do we have available for spending in future periods? And that's, not to nerd out on you guys too much, but that's called a modified accrual basis of accounting. So it's mentally easiest to think of it as kind of cash basis. So it's actually cash. What happens in your bank account, money coming in is a revenue, money going out is an expense, plus what you owe at year end within 60 days, roughly. So C5 is modified accrual, and that is how you guys budget your funds. So when you're preparing a budget for, say, the general fund, that's kind of that modified cash basis. So financial statements tend to have more detail in the back and less detail in the front. So this is kind of high-level detail. So you can see you have three funds, general fund, conservation trust, debt service fund. We have revenues coming in, and again, there's a breakout in the back of what makes up taxes, licenses, permits, so forth. So we had 11,400,000 coming into the general fund, another, call it, million between conservation trust fund, which is your lottery money. So we had a total coming into the governmental fund, all your governmental funds, which is pretty much everything but water, of 12.3 million. So that's, mentally think of that, that's what got deposited into your bank accounts. Then expenditures go out, and again, they're broad categories. You can see the general fund had 7.9 million go out, 8.8 million in total. We have some other financing transactions, but and we have a special item. So we actually included in this financial statement the Tabor refund that your attorneys advised of 1.8 million. So revenues come in, expenses go out, add on what the attorneys say you owe for Tabor, and you get to this third line from the bottom that says excess deficiency of revenues and other financing sources over expenditures and other financing uses, which is a really long-winded method of saying net income or net loss. So what this statement is designed to measure is, did we add to our bank balances or did we reduce our bank balances? And you added 1.9 million to your general fund balance. That's your net income for the year. 19,913 to our conservation trust fund and 16,000 to our debt service fund. Then we say, okay, where did we start the year? We started the year with 3.3 million in the general fund, and we added 1.9, so we ended with 5.2 million. So first thing you look at, you go, wow, 1.9 million, that's a good addition to your fund balances. But that really is only kind of half the story as it relates to Basalt. Usually I like to take the ending balance of 5.2 million and divide it by the total expenditures for the year of 7.9 and say, okay, what do you have for kind of a percentage? That's a common metric for governments. 5.2 divided by 7.9, call it 66%. So 66% is your total fund balance divided by what you spend. That's a reasonable, prudent, normal fund balance for a municipality your size. And it's kind of hard to say how much, because when you compare municipality to municipality, like there's a reason that property taxes funded fire districts and school districts, and sales taxes funded more municipalities and counties. It's because property taxes tend to be really stable, whereas sales tax kind of goes up and down with economic activity. So when you're asking how much fund balance you should have, it's kind of a mix of what's your revenue streams coming in, and like property taxes, you have to have 3 months before you even kind of get any. So you have to have a reserve of minimum of 25% for property tax dependent entities. But 66% is kind of a normal balance that I would expect to see for a municipality of your size. The problem, or maybe the challenge that I see is, even though you have 5.2 million, if we kind of jump back a page, sorry, 2 pages, to page C3, you'll see it's a balance sheet. We have our assets up here, and again, these are all kind of short-term assets. We don't have capital assets or long-term debt on here, because it's kind of designed to measure what you have available to spend. And here we have this 5.2 million of fund balance. But if you kind of look at what makes that up, we have 3.9 million of restricted fund balance and 1,068,000 of unrestricted. So even though you have a really solid kind of normal fund balance in total, the amount that's available for spending on whatever you need it for is pretty restricted. So then I like to say, okay, well, what's that 1,068,000? I'd like to divide that into the 7 million that you spent and come up with a reserve, and that's 1,068,000 divided by 7.9 is 16%. So long story short, you had a pretty good year in total, but all those funds are restricted, and you don't have a lot of unrestricted fund balance available. The conservation trust is pretty minimal, and debt service is pretty minimal. So the kind of, as I mentioned, this was designed to measure what's happening to your bank accounts. You added a lot to your bank accounts, but again, it's in a very specific restricted account. So I slide over and I say, okay, we added 1.9 million to our accounts. The second set of books is full accrual, like a business would keep their books. So full accrual is designed to measure, are you better off kind of in total than you were the last year? So an example would be, if you want more fund balance, let's just go get a line of credit. You'll have more money in the bank. Sorry, not a line of credit. Let's issue debt. You'll have more money in the bank, but you'll also have more debt. So it's really designed to show when towns make long-term decisions that maybe have short-term impacts. So if you kind of scroll down.
Can I just ask you a quick
Sure.
question here? So, how does this ratio of unrestricted and restricted funds affect our policy goals for reserves?
Well, I probably would have to have a better understanding of what your policy goals are to answer that.
Okay.
My job is to make sure that you guys have the correct numbers to make decisions. You guys ultimately have to decide where you're comfortable with.
Well, we
those
have
numbers.
a policy goal about
And it's
reserves.
30%.
Oh,
33% of
Yeah.
unrestricted expenditures.
that's correct. I did see that in your policy manual. Sorry, I kind of misunderstood what you're saying. You meet the
We do
33%.
Okay.
You meet it.
That's what I wanted to know.
But that policy goal is very general in the fact that it's just saying total fund balance. It's not really saying unrestricted versus restricted. And one of the things we're going to talk about,
I'm not sure that's right. Clarification.
Yeah, I was gonna say,
It is unrestricted.
Yeah, it's
Is it?
Yeah,
unrestricted.
yeah.
well,
So
then you wouldn't.
not.
I thought it was total, was my recollection, but, so you actually wouldn't meet it if it's unrestricted. One of the things that.
Wait.
yeah, That's
We
what
wouldn't
passed.
made it. No,
We would not
We're
be.
17% unrestricted,
Yeah.
66% total.
Right. And you had also found that we actually had a shortfall in the policy objective. Rather than having 2.6 million, we have 1.0 something or other, 1,068,000. And so we're actually 1,600,000 short in the policy goal of having 2.6 of unrestricted expenditures, which is one of the points that I wanted to bring up.
Okay, so
So-
I wanted to make sure that I was understanding this, but that's what I thought.
That's
was the
correct.
answer.
I apologize. I thought it was 33 in total, but one of the things that we'll get into in a little bit is, I think your financial statements are kind of more difficult to understand than they really need to be. And I would kind of strongly recommend that you maybe create an additional fund and you put that restricted revenue in that fund, because that would allow you to kind of differentiate more clearly in the general fund how much is unrestricted. I mean, you have so many restricted revenue streams. I think if you kind of pulled that out and said, yes, we have 3.9 million in restricted fund balance in this fund, but we can only use it for those purposes, it would be a little easier to analyze your financial statements. So I don't know, that's kind of up to you guys, but I would consider that. Let me run back here. So we added 1.9 million to our total fund balances, right? So if you flip that page, you'll see that's the top number on page C6. And we have to account for kind of long-term changes that have short-term impacts. So the first one is, yes, we spent 1.4 million on capital assets last year. So yes, we have less cash in the bank, but we have a different asset, right? We paid 818,000 down on net on kind of long-term debt. So yes, we have less money in the bank, but we have less debt, so we add that back. Then we say, okay, if we were a business using full accrual, we would capitalize our assets and we would depreciate them, which means record the cost of those assets off over the life, right? So your depreciation expense would be 1.1 million, and then you have some other little changes that have impacts. So basically, if you were keeping your books on a full accrual, you would have had net income of $3 million. So what that tells me is you're not making long-term decisions that are impacting you on a short-term basis. A common example that I see would be you issue 20-year debt to build a building that has a 30-year life, and maybe 10 years into it, you refinance the debt with a longer term, and suddenly you have 40-year debt on a 30-year building. That's what this is kind of designed to show. And the reason I kind of wanted to walk you through both both focuses, kind of the full accrual and the modified accrual, is because you really have to kind of be a little careful when you're reading the financial statements, understanding, am I looking at the full accrual numbers or am I looking at the modified accrual? You guys are going to be way more comfortable looking kind of at the fund numbers because that's how you budget. And I think that's kind of how most non-accountants think, is what do I have in the bank? So there's a fair amount of other information. There is, financial statements on the water fund. Those are on that kind of full accrual basis because it's a business. There's also footnotes in here. The footnotes, cover a lot of different data. Where do we have our cash and investments? How long do we depreciate our assets? What are some of the differences between short and long term? We also do include, at least in our financial statements, debrucing questions specifically in your Tabor footnote. That's all our governments have that, but you can see in 1994 there's that question passed by the electorate. What receivables do we have? Are we going to collect them? What capital assets did we add? Lines of credit, that'll kind of come up in a little bit too, but you do have these 2 lines of credit, disclosure of those. long-term debt. So there's just a lot of information in here. We did have to go back, and then there's a lot of pension information that relates to FPPA, and that's all pretty typical information that you would see on a municipality that participates. There's kind of a couple things though that I'll point out. We did change your opening balances. So from your last year's audited balances, so that's called a restatement. Restatements can kind of vary in type, but there were kind of 4 main areas, and at least 3 of them were kind of listed as challenges. So we did the capital assets when we got those. They didn't necessarily tie to, so Christy, I think, contacted your previous auditor, got the capital asset schedules, correct me if I'm wrong, but they didn't agree to the financial statements from last year. So we kind of backed up and kind of went through each asset and spent a fair amount of time trying to make sure that we had correct numbers as the schedule to back up what's in the audited report. So we had some changes both on the water fund and kind of general assets. And then the other was the lines of credit last year were shown as a long-term obligation. I don't really agree with that presentation. That is a short-term obligation. You may renew it, but it's not a long-term fiscal obligation. So we chose to kind of pull that off that full accrual view and reduce your fund balances for the amount that's owed on those lines of credit. Those were kind of the 2 big changes, and you'll see those in a letter that we go through. But I guess the rest of the financial statements have budget to actual in there. I don't think there's probably a whole lot in there that would be surprising to you guys. And then there's pension and statistical information. But before I kind of move on to the letter, I guess I just want to make sure everyone's comfortable with the audited financial statements. And if there's questions, I'm happy to try and answer them.
Anybody have questions before he moves on?
Fine-tooth comb is all I have to say.
Okay.
Okay, so
Can I note one thing on the financials?
sure.
Okay. Just wanted to note that as part of the management discussion and analysis, one thing that Ryan and myself heard loud and clear is that you guys want a accounting every year of the restricted balances in every single one of our restricted accounts. So now we've put that as part of a permanent part of our MD&A, management discussion analysis report. So we always have that historical data to go back on to improve transparency on that.
Excellent.
Yeah, so this just shows kind of the changes in restricted balances, both in the footnotes, which is required, and in the MD&A. So there is a governing board letter that goes from independent auditors to governing boards, and it includes items that we're required to communicate to you, some of which are applicable and some of which aren't. The first, in true kind of nerd language, is qualitative aspects of accounting policies. In English, that means were there changes in accounting policies that impacted the financial statements. There wasn't really a change in accounting policies per se in like governmental accounting standards board statement, but there was a transaction with the Tabor refund where we recorded that, and I think you guys all are aware of that. The second part of that paragraph is what's the biggest estimate in the financial statements. So sometimes you have really hard to estimate items. Environmental liability, you know it's going to cost a lot, but you don't know how much. Legal liability. You guys have kind of 3 liabilities. One is the pension obligation that you have as being a member of FPPA, the Fire and Police Pension Association. So we get their data from their actuaries, and we just kind of crunch the numbers for the town. But obviously their actuaries come up with how long everybody in their pool is going to live and what their investments are going to return, and that's an estimate. The second is kind of what is the ultimate liability for Tabor. I feel like you probably have a pretty good handle on that, but it at least is an estimate. And then the last is how long are assets going to last. So we have to record depreciation, and if we record, if you use an asset longer than we depreciated, then we recorded too much. Otherwise, we recorded not enough, but you follow standard lives. So there really isn't, and are you gonna collect all your receivables? But those are pretty typical, other than the Tabor refund one for most municipal governments. Difficulties encountered in performing the audit, it really was kind of the three that we somewhat talked about. It was trying to get our hands around what you ultimately decided for how to handle your Tabor issue. Trying to get accurate fixed asset records, and making sure we recorded the lines of credit where they needed to be, as opposed to kind of as a long-term liability. Corrected and uncorrected misstatements, that's probably the most critical thing. Sometimes we come in and the finance team has uploaded their data, and, you know, like as an example, you look at that Alpine Bank statement or a call trust statement, and you go, okay, they forgot to record interest income or something, and so we record that as an audit entry, and it's correct when we're done, but it wasn't correct when we started. And so obviously when you have a lot of audit entries, you can still have an unmodified opinion because the financial statements are correct, but they weren't correct when you started, and that means council wouldn't be getting accurate information. We went through all your entries, and honestly, every material adjustment was handled prior to when we walked in, which is kind of where you want your clients to be. So if we're making a lot of entries, then it's generally not good. So we did have a lot of journal entries last year, but they were made prior to our arrival. We didn't have any disagreements, at least that I know of, with management. But that would be kind of rare. And your staff does sign what's called a management representation letter, or they will when we issue a final. I call that the I didn't lie, cheat, or steal letter. So they'll be required to sign that. We did have a couple recommendations. One is we noticed that the town code had a requirement for a personnel review board, and we understand you guys are kind of working on amending that code, but we just wanted to point out that that is a requirement of the code. In our discussions with staff, it was noted that you guys actually own enough units in the Riverside, in the BC Condominium Association to control the board. That's called a component unit, kind of in accounting language. And one of the things that generally has to happen is you want kind of everything that falls under your responsibility to be audited. So there's a couple different ways to kind of handle that, and we kind of talk through it with your staff a little bit, but just be aware it's not material per se to the town, but because you can appoint a voting majority of that board, ultimately it falls under your responsibility, and it should in the future be included as a component unit in your audited financial statements. We would recommend you actually do a formal investment policy. I mean, you do have pretty vanilla standard investments, but it would be good just to pass an investment policy. Your personnel policy does mention a vacation limit for employees of 220 hours, but there was some employees that exceeded that. That's relatively common at municipal governments, but I would recommend you either kind of, some choose to buy them down, some choose to increase the policy or the accrual limit. It would really be up to you guys how you want to handle that. The next would be you may want to consider participating in the GFOA program. That requires the financial statements to be issued by June 30th. If you decide to do that, we'll kind of help you through that. But essentially, it's kind of a secondary review. So we would send your financial statements to the Government Finance Officers Association. They would review it and come back with comments on, hey, we think you need to improve this disclosure, or this doesn't make sense, whatever it is. I think it's kind of worthwhile, at least for the town to consider that. but we would have to do that going forward because we weren't timely this year. And the last is just a notice that, so the Governmental Accounting Standards Board, they kind of produce financial statement, or they produce standards that say, here's what your financial statement should look like. They just have a new standard coming out. We'll work with Christy to make sure you guys implement that. I don't think it's gonna have a big impact on the town, but we just wanted to make you aware that that was up and coming. So that's either a quick or a painfully long review of the financial statements, but I'd be happy to try and answer any questions, yeah.
I was just going to ask Christy if she had anything else to add.
No, the only thing that I'd really add is overall, it was an extremely thorough audit. He had us working very hard. What was it, 374 work papers? Something to that effect.
Yeah, so, and that would be just, let's take a look. So if you look, 363 work papers that we actually scanned in, and you kind of saw a lot of them here. I mean, each one of these documents is a work paper that we scanned in to kind of verify the information in the audited financial statement, and then we probably looked at 100 others that we didn't scan in and just documented that we looked at it. So it was a fine-tooth comb.
And I'm grateful for that fine-tooth comb. I think it's exactly what we needed in the town, and it just really gives us a great starting point for 2019 in looking at our information for budgeting. So that's really exciting as well. And I just love the forward-looking aspects of just the recommendations he made at the end of the audit. Looking at a GFOA award in our future is a really great focus for this town to really get to excellence in budgeting and auditing our financials, information, and just giving our community the best of what we can into the future.
Thanks,
So-
Christy. Okay, comments, questions from council? Bill?
Thank you guys very much for some great work, and I certainly, after speaking with Christy and Ryan last week, have great confidence that we are in very safe, secure, and sound shape. But that doesn't mean I don't have a few questions.
Sure.
One that we discussed in the letter to the governing board on page 3, which was this whole Riverside LLC property. And it was a question about recourse to the town. We should probably see what Jeff has to say about this as well. But if by virtue of owning a majority of the units, we therefore have a majority interest in the HOA, would there ever be any recourse to the town in the event that the Riverside property incurred debt or had a catastrophic disaster? Ryan and Cindy both said, no recourse to us, but I'm just interested to confirm that.
I caught the tail end of that,
Oh.
but I think the question
This is the Riverside HOA, where in the notes of the governing board, they've highlighted our supermajority in
Right.
terms of ownership. And so the question is, could anybody ever come back to us and seek compensation from the town because of something that happens over there?
A couple of things. I think the association board had not been, I think, properly, I'm trying to remember this, the board not been properly constituted over time, and it since has been properly constituted with some town appointees to the board. But in terms of town liability by virtue of being on the board, the association as an entity provides indemnification to officers and directors so long as there are not willful and wanton actions or grossly negligent actions. So within that context, then, so long as those types of things aren't occurring, there's not a recourse against individuals from the town serving on the board.
I had a feeling that would be the case. The bigger question has to do with this whole kind of notion of reserves. If the balance of restricted to unrestricted is heavily skewed towards restricted, that means the majority of our funds are not available to finance expenditures. And if we are underfunded with regard to our policy threshold of 33% of unrestricted expenditures to the tune of like $1.6 million, on the one hand, we're in very secure financial shape, but our reserves do not appear sufficient to satisfy our policy, and the policy is based upon our anticipated worst-case scenario. So how do we capture that? You did it on page B5 of the audit report, and then, and so I guess this is just a general question. What do we need to do to respond to this in the budget year process that's coming up?
If I may just chime in, one of our strategies that we've committed to this year is to get rid of that short-term line of credit that we have that was booked as a long-term liability, but in actuality, it's a short-term. So that affects our fund balance. When we pay that off, we've just sold Shining Mountain Way with the aim to pay that off. That will have a positive net effect on our fund balance. So I think that is one of our strategies to make sure that comes back up. And by the way, that debt is about $1.6 million. So.
Right. So that's a wash, but that doesn't change the cash position, right? We're using the cash from Shining Way to retire debt. That's a good thing, fully supported. But it doesn't put cash in the bank to satisfy our policy goal of 33%, nor.
So we have the cash in the bank. It's just a matter that we had this, liability now on our books that now then we're gonna be able to take off of our books, buy something that was not on our governmental funds, which is Shining Mountain Way property. So we just liquidated that property, made it cash so that we could pay off that debt, and that's how it increases our fund balance. So, but I can go through that math with you guys, because I think that'll be an important part of our planning into our 2020 budget as we start the budget kickoff, in how we're gonna make sure we meet our fund balance requirements.
Good idea.
So we've got a couple other ideas as well.
Then I think the line item review of the restricted fund balances is excellent. Love that, because that was a big source of kind of confusion or of just uncertainty. It is much clearer now, and this is really great. I guess the only other point that we had discussed was the assessed property values in the notes on page 87, where they were jumping around between.
Page what, Bill?
Page 87, jumping around from a couple million to a couple billion. And it kind of seemed like something might have been off.
So that would be the statistical section. Which isn't audited, but we did note that and have made that change. Let me just find that. So I believe you're talking about, which page was it?
87?
D19.
Could you give that page to us in reference to how it's actually on the paper pages?
We did make that adjustment today, Bill, so this is the draft financial you'll see, so.
So that's the only change, I forgot to mention that, that's the only change that would be made. It's G9.
G9.
So if you actually look right here, this is the numbers that would be in the final. But again, I'm not trying to equivocate, but that's the kind of unaudited part that we don't really spend
Okay.
time on.
That's it. Great job.
Is that it? Anybody else? Katie? Really? Well, the most thorough audit ever in the history of the world in Basalt since I've been here, and I have been here since dirt. So we totally appreciate it. We really appreciate the work that Christy put in. She has driven herself into her deathbed apparently with fatigue, but I think that won't be happening in the future. I have a feeling that, the road is going to be smoother from here on out on the financial side of things, and we really do appreciate your work. You have anything, Ryan?
Nope.
And I think normally there's a motion to accept this. The only change would be on G9, which is kind of an unaudited section. And then if you're okay with that, we would pull the draft off and start filing with all the parties. So ultimately, this draft's gonna go to all your bondholders, to your banking relationships, federal grants, state grants, Colorado State Auditor, so forth.
Are you saying that when we make the motion, we should say something different about G?
I got it. Mayor, I move that town council accept the 2018 audit as stated with the amended page G9.
It's good. Is there a second? Further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? We're good.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
for
you
your
guys.
work.
Thank
Good
you.
job.
I'm thinking 5 minutes. I need 5 minutes.
Feel free.
All right.
Let's do this.
Our next item is first reading of ordinance 14 of 2019, an ordinance of the town amending Chapter 7, Article 7 related to the town's dog leash laws. Ryan, Greg, Jeff, whoever can talk first.
So I think I'll kick it off, and then I'll have my colleagues jump in for support. But as you recall, we brought this to the council, I think it was back in May, actually, and had a brief discussion about some ideas coming from staff and some community members with regard to leash law. So we do have a leash law currently on the books. It's just not strictly enforced. But we have had some incidents over the years where we have some dog bites that do occur. Sometimes dogs are on a leash, sometimes they're at large, so it's a bit of a mix. But it's also my understanding, before I arrived back in 2016 maybe, you all had a discussion on leash laws, and it's kind of been hanging out there. So we brought it back to you, and essentially the idea and direction from you all was to bring back an ordinance that would amend our current code as it related to dogs at large, and be able to have the ability to designate certain areas within town where you could have your dog off a leash. And basically this ordinance just provides the authority and contemplates, a path for doing that. We would still have to bring back a subsequent ordinance designating those areas, okay? Essentially, what we would like to do, and thoughts around this which aren't fully developed yet, but as far as enforcement, we would try to do education piece first and talk to people and kind of discuss why we're looking at greater enforcement in the town, point people to whatever designated areas we have established, and then, basically just encourage people that while they're going to and fro those areas that their dogs be leashed. I think this has ultimately the benefit of those that are either scared of dogs or have a dog that is perhaps vicious itself, and they're trying to stay away from other dogs running up to it. They would be able to, kind of modify their normal walk with their dog and, kind of avoid that area. So this is only the beginning. We'd still have to bring back another ordinance, as I said. We did have some direction from the Parks and Rec master plan that identified some areas for dogs, and those coincide with what we had identified. So we kind of thought that sort of each area of town should have a place where dogs could be off leash. On the south side, you have the big grass area, the South Side Park. We've got Albany Park, and then a piece of linear park that's kind of separated from the playground area where you have a lot of kids running around. And those are the three that we've identified. Certainly, we want direction from council on any other possible areas that might make sense for you. But that, in a nutshell, is where we are right now. And I don't know, Chief, if you had anything to add, or Jeff?
Yeah, so in conversations with community members, we understand that people want to have their dogs off leashes to exercise them, to socialize, to get their dogs out there and, and have fun. We also have conversations with people who are afraid or are not as mobile, get knocked down, or have dogs that just are not approachable by other animals. So what this is I think this is an extremely good example of community policing and how we try to solicit as many, input opportunities as we can to try and come with a compromise to address the issues of the ones that don't want leashes in certain areas and ones that do. So this is the opportunity for us to decide kind of how we go about doing that. So I appreciate this opportunity and the ability to obtain direction from you all.
Great, thanks. Well, I think even though this is not the public hearing piece of this, that's normally happens at second reading, If there are people in the audience who have comments that they would like to make regarding the leash law in front of us, we would ask that you could come up right now and maybe limit your comments to 3 minutes. Is there anybody that has comments regarding the leash law in front of us? Because what's going to happen is it looks like next time the actual ordinance that's calling out our initial locations where dogs will be off leash will be, oh, yes.
Clarification,
Yes,
sorry.
clarify.
No, we would have to, this ordinance just creates that ability in the
Okay.
code, and then we'd have to bring back yet a separate
That's what I'm
ordinance
trying
for
to
that. Yeah,
say.
sorry.
Okay, all right. So is there anybody here that has any comments regarding that? Please come up and just state your name. If you could, please. Sure. Just because otherwise we can't pick up your side of the conversation.
My name is Ben Brennan. I've lived in Basalt since 2006. And during that time, I've had a dog the entire time, 2 different ones. And I live in the villas in Elk Run right over here. And I walk like 3 times, 4 times a day, my dog, from my house over basically to Albany Park, but also kind of around the neighborhood, go to the river and stuff like that. And I guess just my overall opinion is that I don't feel like we need a change. In all of that time, I don't feel like there has been a failure in our own ability to police each other as dog owners, and to have a one-on-one conversation with somebody else that has a dog that might be causing a problem. Either it's like going to the bathroom and the dog isn't being picked up, or if somebody is, having a dog that's aggressive or whatever, that they don't like have words with them. And I feel like it's worked fine so far. If we do move in the direction of having to have these designated places, I feel like, and I've talked to a couple other people about them, there needs to be more than just 3 areas. So that's about it.
Thank you so much for your time, for coming in.
Okay.
Okay. Others? Yes. Hi.
My name's Lisa George. I live here. I actually hadn't come to address this, but I just wanted to throw out that I would just recommend and suggest everybody just study what's going on in the valley. Crown Park, for example, there have been a lot of altercations. Carbondale, and just to understand the big picture. And my only issue as a parent over the years were off-leash dogs that come into the playgrounds with young children. Mm-hmm. And so please, just when you're looking at this, address that issue, because I've seen it in every playground in the valley, large dogs coming in, and there are little children playing. So just address that. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa, for your comments. Any others?
Hi, I'm Sean Rios. I live in Elk Run, and so I live right behind Basalt Middle School, and that path is really busy with dogs, and I would just propose that we keep it the same as it is, because it doesn't seem to be that problematic, but I don't know all of the issues, and I'm just catching up on this. So we have a dog, we do walk him off leash at times, and I would think just enforce those who become issues, who have a dog that is aggressive, and instead of everyone else having to pay for that. So I would say keep it the same.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
Hi, John Mosier. I live over on Swinging Bridge. Have 2 older chocolate labs, and I just hope that there's some common sense in regards to any new ordinance. I lived in Denver, and I had a day where I was with my dog, and it was a couple days before Christmas, and it was below 0, and there's no one in the park. My dog would run with his leash, and I got a ticket. Those moments where it's clear there's nobody around, don't enforce the rule in that particular situation. I certainly understand the concerns with playgrounds and with people who are afraid of dogs, and certainly I always have a leash on me and always ready to, in case I can tell someone's uncomfortable, then I put the leash on. But just common sense is pretty much the only thing have a concern about. I just hope it's used.
Thanks, John. Good comments. Anyone else? Okay, council, any thoughts, comments, motions, anything? Jen?
I'd like to suggest a couple more places, locations that could be leash-free that are commonly visited by dog people, and I really appreciate all of the comments. We do have a very good community policing and discussion and calling. I mean, even earlier this week, I called Bill of, hey, I'm in your neighborhood, is it safe to let my dogs out? And that's part of how we keep this community and that social fabric. That's one thing that dogs are, our social fabric, for sure. So a couple of my ideas for additional places would be the Basalt River Park until they get the C of O. That's just such a very common dog community off-leash, large grassy area that is not next to a playground. And another one is the 7-Eleven swimming hole area. That is down, when you're at 7-Eleven and you walk down where the confluence of the Roaring Fork, there's a really big swimming hole there. And that's a great dog swimming location that children commonly are not at. Another is the swinging bridge area, the path that goes along the Roaring Fork. Again, it's not by a school, it's by a river, it's not by a road. And I'd love to hear from Willits people if they feel that the one area of Linear Park, I recognize that the rugby field has no dog signs and historically has been dogless or no dogs allowed, but proposing that area or again a water access. There is a pathway by the lake, and that's another common dog swimming location. It doesn't have to be the entire lake or the entire path around there, but at least a place where the dogs can run, fetch a water item, and come back.
May I ask a clarification? Excuse me for interrupting. You said swinging bridge along the Roaring Fork. Are you talking Ponderosa Park?
No.
Roaring Fork or swinging bridge on the Frying Pan?
On the Frying Pan, excuse me.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
We have those two areas that have
Exactly.
along the river.
And then thanks, Chief, you brought up my last place is Ponderosa Park.
Okay.
Again, not by a school, and a rural area, again, with water access. And what is very positive is there already are poop boxes at all of these locations, and these are already commonly visited places.
Other council comments? Got it? I am trying to think in my own mind whether we start out huge and then have complaints and come back, or if we start out smaller with fewer air. I mean, I don't know. I would ask staff to just think that through, speak with the police, see, where maybe is best. But it does sound like that, for the most part, many of these areas are dog-ready anyway, with boxes and stuff there. So I would ask staff to just take a look at it further, and bring us back what you think to mull next time. So on this one, I guess we're just bringing it back. But it's this one and a different one as well?
It would be, after this one gets adopted, then we'd have the authority once
Okay.
it becomes.
Got it, okay. So if there's no further discussion, is there a motion on this?
Mayor, I move that town council approve ordinance number 14, series of 2019 on first reading and set the public hearing and second reading for August 13th, 2019.
Is there a second? We have a first? We have 3 seconds.
I don't know. I didn't hear it, so.
Actually, we got a second right here.
Okay.
And then another one. Further discussion? All in favor, aye?
Aye.
Opposed? Great. Thank you for your work.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you for coming in.
And sitting through the finance presentation.
Oh, my God.
All of you.
Oh, geez, really. We should, actually, we have candy up here for everybody who stayed. Okay, next item is first reading of ordinance 15 of 2019, an ordinance of the town approving a voluntary refund of overcollected revenues from the town's general operating mill levy for fiscal years 2016 to 2019. Ryan, Christie, Jeff?
Yeah, I've asked Jeff to just present the ordinance.
Sure. So I will begin by saying we've had ongoing discussions about two Tabor issues. An issue with the town's mill levy rate and an issue with the revenue received from the town's mill levy over time. And there's been discussions as to how to address those two issues. This ordinance and the next ordinance deal with what do we do with the revenue received from the town's operating mill levy in excess of the low point that the mill levy has ever been set at. We had provided a framework for discussion for council in prior meetings that really set out three options in relation to that revenue. One was to do nothing, and the other two were, let me back up. One was to do nothing and I guess, deal with any legal challenge that might be presented. The other two options were fixes to the problem that had been presented. One of those fixes was to potentially go to voters and seek voter approval to retain the excess revenue that was received. The other option was to pursue a voluntary refund of the revenues received. And at our last council meeting, the direction that was provided to staff was to move forward on preparing an ordinance to proceed with a voluntary refund of that money. So that is what is in your packet, is to authorize a voluntary refund for excess revenues received from the general operating mill levy from 2016 to 2019. I do want to say a couple quick things that are just slight amendments to the form of the ordinance, just to point out on first reading that we'll bring back in second reading. One is that in recital, in the recital L, we'll need to insert the reference to ordinance number 16, and that ordinance is the next on the agenda, and that is, okay, if we're going to pursue the voluntary refund, how do we pay for it? And the proposed payment for the voluntary refund is through lease certificates of purchase, and that's our next action item. So this is just a reference to that ordinance. The second change that will need to be made between first and second reading is there's just a typo in paragraph 2 of the ordinance where it states the town council authorizes such, and then the sentence stops and then it begins the next sentence. So I just wanted to point that out, so would be part of any motion that those two changes would be made. But with that introduction, I think I'll stop and see if there are any other questions. But this is an ordinance that was consistent with the direction provided by town council at our last town council meeting, and again would be to issue that voluntary refund as a fix to the excess revenue received generated from the mill levy.
Questions, comments, motions?
I have a quick question. Who of our staff, or is it going to be administered outside? Who's responsible for administering the refunds?
So we would likely be hiring an outside firm. We don't have the capacity within our staff to do this work. So we've engaged and are seeking bids from a few different firms for that work, and we've contemplated that cost within the overall cost of the refund. So it won't come out of our general fund.
Okay, answered all my questions in one answer. Good job.
Bill?
Comments? My comments, as with last weekend, are pretty much unchanged. But for the record, I understand and fully agree that we are going to put to the voters a question related to approval of the 5957. That is undisputed. We need to do that according to Tabor, and this is what UND have advised. But as I noted last week, I do have a very different opinion on the refund. And I happen to believe that the voters should decide whether to permit us to retain or to refund. Legal counsel and Dee Weiser, Colorado's foremost Tabor expert, have agreed that if the voters approve, then the town has a legally safe option to retain the funds. And I think we should take your counsel. I want to note that every penny of the tax collected was spent for the public good and for the benefit of Basalt. I also want to point out that the flip side of a refund is $3 million in debt. The refund is not free. Issuing a refund means that nearly a $3 million liability, representing both principal and interest, is going to saddle the Basalt voters. And so, I would argue that if our taxpayers and residents customarily approve taking on new debt, they should be permitted to decide in this instance too. I guess I'd conclude by saying I don't see any downside to letting the voters decide. And I think that with the right ballot language, we could secure approval to set the mill and avoid $3 million in debt. Voters can handle the two questions, in my opinion, if we explain the costs and benefits clearly. I've heard arguments about buying goodwill, and I do not think we can buy goodwill or trust with a refund. You can't buy trust with a $900 rebate. And finally, I would just argue that trust is built over years, and if we are transparent and open, then we will begin that process. But I do not support the voluntary refund. I think the voters should be the ones who decide.
Thanks, Bill.
You're welcome.
Others?
So, I think we're struggling with two different forces, both trying to do the right thing here. One is, frankly, from my perspective, I agree with you, Bill. It worries me to take on debt, especially given the conversation we just had about restricted and unrestricted funds. That's a big deal to add debt, especially given our common experience of bailing ourselves out, right, and building up the reserve. So it's that good intent, and it's the other good intent of, there's a case to be made that we need to comply directly with Tabor now. I do think that that the vote option is good. I think it's going to be, the voters are smart. They can understand this issue, and the mill levy reaffirmation will pass, and then the second one can pass or not, and then we are in the same position we'd be in today. So that's where I land, but I understand where everyone's coming from here in terms of the other side of that.
Thanks, Auden. Yes.
Madam Mayor, I just wanted to say a couple of things that I should have said in the beginning of my introduction to the ordinance. Again, this ordinance is to authorize the voluntary refund, to authorize staff to pursue that. The form of the refund would be through checks. We had discussed different options as to what that would take, whether it be a temporary property tax credit or or through issuing checks, and it is through issuing checks. And one thing that in doing some research that we had thought would be appropriate to potentially include in that refund check is an option for recipients of the refund check to gift that amount back to the town. We've seen that used in other jurisdictions, so this would also authorize the town staff to include that as part of the refund and investigate whether those gift backs could be designated for specific purposes within the town. And I should have said those things at the outset, and I just wanted to clarify that as council continued to discuss. So.
That was a good one to remember. Thanks. Anybody else? Is there a motion?
What, can I ask one more question? Sure. Can that money be gifted to another entity? Or the town could take that money and put it in an independent fund?
The town, well, if the town accepts money, one of the thoughts that we've been throwing about is in offering that people could send the refund check back, that could come with a request that it go towards a specific use. So it could be any number of uses. We'd probably limit it, but daycare, wildfire mitigation, the arts. You know, we could get direction from council on what that might be, and then to the extent we received checks back, refunds, then we would restrict that money for those uses. So yes, and kind of the first part of your question, which was, can people give it to?
Well, that's
another
obvious, yeah.
use, right?
Yeah.
You can do whatever with your check. Okay, yeah.
I'll just briefly reiterate where I stand, that the short gain of not refunding is far more dangerous than not having the mill levy approved. And that is what I, at the foremost, want to ensure passes. And I'm not willing to risk one for the other with looking at our citizens' voting patterns. And this ordinance goes along with approving and ensuring our financial stability.
Well, I have to say that, you know, I've been listening to the same arguments for several weeks now, and I think that all the parties have good thoughts, and we can't guarantee anything, no matter what we do. So where I come from is that I believe the staff has done due diligence for us that I couldn't imagine us not having that information, that the work that they have done, and that's where I'm putting my trust, is in the staff's recommendation, the staff's research, and special counsel input on this. So I guess I would just ask for a motion, because we can do this for quite some time.
Mayor, I move that the town council approve ordinance number 15, series of 2019 on first reading, and set the public hearing and second reading for August 13th, 2019.
Is there a second?
Second.
Further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
Opposed.
Opposed? You see hands, please. Okay, thank you. Sorry.
Thank you, everybody, for your thoughtfulness. I'm certainly not saying that I think you're wrong. I just am putting my faith in.
Jackie, can I make one comment? There has been discussion in the community that if this happens, that there be a community group and basically a movement led by leaders who commit up front to not take the refund and allow it to go into a voluntary fund. And this is a really interesting approach, because what it would potentially you could do is take that money and have it administered by the foundation, the community foundation, or citizens dedicated to whatever people wanted: childcare, healthcare, education. And there's this positive opportunity to turn lemons into lemonade and to take government money, and instead of, hey, you can give it back to the government and they'll trust us, we'll do something with it, put it in the hands of the people, or put it in the hands of a respected third party. You could have citizens advise the foundation. I don't know if this is even practical, Ryan, but you could then get a movement where people, you know, and say, no, this money can go to good community causes. This isn't my idea, by the way, and benefit the community. And we could actually build a community chest or trust fund that could grow into the future. It's a kind of an interesting spin. And so I just urge this group and staff to be open to that conversation. I know that has been going on already. It's pretty cool.
I think there's different ways that we could accept the money that would give the citizens some trust that it was really going to go to the greater good. I think that's something that we just need to talk about, but we don't have time right now. Yeah.
I have an article that I'll forward to everyone. I forwarded it to Ryan already, and there is another municipality that had a similar, and they utilized the funds towards wildfire mitigation. And it's a great read, so I'll forward it to you all.
So definitely some cool options. So, okay, can I go on?
Yes.
Okay. Next one is ordinance, okay, that was the first one, 16, an ordinance authorizing the financing of a voluntary refund of overcollected revenues from the town's general operating mill levy for fiscal years 2016 to 2019. Did I just say this? And in
Yeah.
connection
No, we're on 7C.
therewith authorizing the sale and subsequent leasing of certain town property and the execution and delivery by the town of a deed, a lease purchase agreement, and other documents related to the financing. Brian, Christie, Jeff.
Jeff?
Okay. So this is part 2 of the revenue issue, and this is how do we fund the voluntary refund? And the proposal method is through lease certificates of purchase. This is a financing mechanism that has been used throughout the state that does not require voter approval and that can be done by the governing body of a local jurisdiction. And here, the proposed mechanism would be to convey to a trustee a property owned by the town, which the town would then lease back, which would in effect act as security for payments to the town that could be then used to render the refund. The town's special counsel and bond counsel, D. Weiser, has prepared this ordinance. He has been the point person on this as bond counsel for the town. This ordinance does approve him acting in that role as bond counsel. Presently, the ordinance contemplates that the town hall property would be used as part of this lease certificates of purchase. But as we're working through this with D and the town's financing consultants, it may be the case that a different property will appear in that place in this ordinance upon second reading. So I'm just highlighting that to council now, but otherwise the framework of this ordinance is as I've described. And so with that, I'd open it up to any questions to council.
Questions about this? Okay,
Mayor, I move the town council approve ordinance number 16, series of 2019 on first reading and set public hearing and second reading for August 13th, 2019.
thanks, Ryan. Is there a second?
Second.
Further discussion? All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Gotcha. Thank you.
We are staying on time.
Did we get caught up again?
Yes.
Don't say it, don't say it. Okay, Resolution 25, a resolution approving an amended IGA with Pitkin County, Colorado, related to collection of the Pitkin County use tax. That would be Christie. Or,
Christie, are you
I'm
good with the
happy to address it.
Okay,
Sure.
that's fine. Either way is fine,
So,
yeah.
as you might recall, a month or two ago, the council approved an IGA with Pitkin County related to the collection of the county's use tax. When you pull a building permit from the town of Basalt, you have to pay an estimate of what your use tax will be to the county. It is administratively difficult for them for that to happen, so this intergovernmental agreement authorized the town to collect that on behalf of the county and then pay it to the county. In that ordinance, it set the estimated amount of use tax that needed to be collected, and upon review, the county would like to have more flexibility in designating what that estimated use tax amount should be. So all this resolution does is amend the existing IGA to, instead of stating basically the percentage amount as to what that estimate would be, it provides the flexibility that amount can be set by ordinance, set by resolution by Pitkin County. So if they want to change it over time, they wouldn't need to come back to the town and change that, or need to go through an ordinance process. They would set what that percentage amount is, let the town know, the town would collect it. So this is a three-word change within the IGA.
okay, sounds like housekeeping,
And
almost.
it is, and just one note, one additional note, in the resolution, if the council, on a motion to approve, I'd recommend that the resolution be amended in recital D to add the following phrase, at the end of that sentence, which is, there was a typo in the IGA that was, I'm sorry, not this sentence, but there was a typo in the IGA as presented to the town from Pickens County. So that's been fixed. And so the amendment would be with the correction of a typographical error in paragraph 2, which is corrected in the enclosed version of the amended IGA.
Mayor, I move that the town council adopt resolution number 25, series of 19, as stated by Jeff.
Okay, all right, is there a second?
Second.
Further discussion? All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Good, on us. Okay, ratification of grant recommendations for first round of BPAC grant program. Watkins.
And Jeff Orslack as well.
And Jeff Arzalak.
Sure. Thanks, guys, for your time.
Sure.
And most importantly, thanks for helping us get this rolling. This is exciting. We have made our first recommendations, and we're excited. And I think what we learned more than anything is there was a pent-up demand for it, because there were a lot of requests. So one of our goals was to make sure that we kind of had a second bite at the apple this year. So we kind of we had a chunk of money to distribute. We distributed half of that, and we're hoping to do another half as the year progresses. And so soon, very soon. So we're excited. We're excited about the applications we have, and they were kind of very varied. Everything from this great Latino project to some music in the streets. So yeah, we're excited. And we're
Okay.
excited for the next round too.
Well, thank you for coming in, and once again, you had to stay for a while too, I guess. Even though we were on time, I think you were back there for a while. So I guess I will just hand this off to council for any questions or comments regarding this program and the presentation. Unless, Watkins, you probably want to say something, sorry.
I could add some details,
Okay.
not to make this any longer for you all, but the grant program was created by resolution by you all in April, and the way it was set up was that BPAC would review the applications first, make a recommendation, and then you all would make the decision. And so once a decision's made, the applicants will be notified, and we'll get the checks cut for the next accounts payable opportunity. You have the
Well, we're actually going to have a little contract that Jeff will prepare, so it
Yes.
may not be
yes.
in the next AP.
So then will there be like some reporting back as to expenditures from the check? Okay.
Yes, and I envision that being kind of project specific too, depending what it is. There may be different
Exactly.
reporting requirements, but yes.
Okay, yeah.
Hey, Jeff, we just let BPAC and yourself know, thank you for serving on this committee and doing this work. It's great.
Yeah, we're excited. And like I said, thanks for giving us the opportunity, guys. We're really excited about it, and it's going to be fun to see these projects go forward.
Strangely, it takes a little work to make it be great.
All good things do.
No kidding. No kidding. Other thoughts? Yes.
I want to bring up what, on the vein of what Watkins was talking about of the reporting methodology and looking at the 7 applications. There's a lot of great ideas out there. And it made me think back to all of the homework that we did as a council. And so I went back to the June 26, 2018 meeting and brought up resolution number 14 of series of 2018, which is the Town Council of Basalt, Colorado, establishing a grant program to be managed by the Basalt Public Arts Commission. And so reading in it, what brought to my attention that relates to the two is in some of the proposals, there was a request for studio space, for salary, etc. And I notice in the TACA item, there is housing for the musicians and food as well. And so looking back into the resolution, it states specifically, where is it here? That grants shall not be awarded for applications with reoccurring funding demands, nor shall grants be awarded for general operating or living expenses. And so I would say that was the reason that the I get all my acronyms mixed up here. The art base next door, they were asking for operating funds, essentially. But I'm also seeing living expenses with the TACA request for the hotel rooms and the meals. And so I'm game for moving forward, except excluding the amounts mentioned in here that cover living expenses.
So that resolution from 2018 is not actually the one that created this grant program. That was voted down in 2018. So what was the resolution that created this program was in April of this year. And the criteria were fairly broad, actually. You know, it said it was more in the veins, the criteria were more in the veins of funded projects must be art that is accessible to the public, things that can be seen, heard, or experienced. And so it did not prohibit living expenses or even general operating expenses, actually. That's something that could be looked at again, but that's how this one was set up.
Yeah, the operating expenses is on your attached.
Yes, Susan?
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just pointing out. Where it is.
Yeah. Okay, well, I just noticed that myself, and I did not go back and look at other resolutions or anything that we talked about. I just wondered if that might be something you might want to look at look at things that are maybe more directly associated with art or performance versus the indirect things. Like, I mean, I don't know if that means that they're getting hotel and food in other towns as they're coming.
That's what it is. The talent is coming, you have to put them somewhere. So
I was just
what we're
wondering
talking about.
if it
It's
just
not-
counted for in this town, or if it was traveling expenses.
It's them, it's a place for them
Whatever.
to stay when they
Here,
come. Yeah,
just here.
the musician comes. So,
Right.
so you have a musician come, and usually when you have a contract with a musician, they part of that contract is you have to house them. So you're paying for their time to play music, you're paying for their time, their housing, and sometimes travel expenses as well, depending on the artist. And sometimes they show up in the back of a van and sleep in the back of the van. So it depends on the contract, but
Right.
I think that application was set up for, you know, a kind of a standard system.
Because they are not getting rich. You could
It's
say.
always shocked me how little musicians get paid, quite honestly. You know, it's amazing to see 10 people show up for $1,000, you know, to play a night, or 1,000 total for the 10. You know, it's amazing. And
Hard life. Thank you for that clarification. Anybody else?
Just
Yes.
thanks and praise to you and the committee.
We got
Yeah.
a live one here.
Thank you guys for doing this. I totally appreciate it. I did want to know what happens to the applications that weren't accepted this time. Are they in like a holding pattern, or do they have to reapply?
They've been notified that they didn't receive the initial recommendation from BPAC, and with a couple of them, I've spoken to them by phone and had kind of a dialogue. And yeah, we are encouraging them to apply again for the second round.
Perfect.
Yeah. I think that what we kind of found was there just wasn't enough funds to go around. So I think some of the new applications might take a harder look at their application and say, you know, how can we get to a spot where it makes sense for the town?
That's great. I mean, and maybe they get access to the winning grants, so they know kind of
Yeah.
what the winners look like.
That's right.
I mean,
And
seriously.
I think we've talked internally as a group that we'd love to focus a little bit more, focus more on education and kids the next round. I think that would be a nice thing to kind of focus on that we didn't in this round. This was more kind of performance, and then also this really interesting one. We're really excited about the single applicant, you know,
Yes.
Latino doing something. It's a small grant. It's like exactly what we want.
Can't
right?
wait to see.
Yeah, we're pretty excited about it. So it's a really touching part of the community that the arts organizations have had trouble getting into. So
Right.
it's good that we're supporting them to get them into it. I think it's a great opportunity.
Thank you again for your persistence, and you too for helping these guys through the process. I think we ended up with a better thing. Is there
Mayor, I
a-
move the town council ratify the recommendations for awards of public arts grants and as recommended by BPAC, and direct town staff to enter into an executive or execute contracts with selected grant recipients.
Second.
Further discussion? All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okey dokey. Thank you.
guys.
Yay.
Thank you. Have a good rest of your evening.
Congratulations.
Hang in there, you're almost there.
And how much do we get paid? Not like musicians. No, far
They get-
less.
Yeah, they get paid more.
Okay, our next item is an executive session. Is there a motion to go into executive session for liquor?
Mayor, I move the town council enter executive session for purpose of discussing personnel matters in accordance with CRS 24-6-4024F, more specifically, Town Manager Ryan Mahoney Annual Review.
Excellent.
How do you know when you're looking on the
Second.
website?
All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
We're in executive session.
And so, this Ryan knows, we will need to come back into open session after the executive session, so we shouldn't shut the whole thing down, right?
Yeah, but if we don't shut the whole thing down, it doesn't shut down. Can you just run it black?
If she's putting
Sound, no.
Okay, the time is now 9:01 PM. The executive session's been concluded. The participants in the executive session were Auden Schendler, Bill Infante, Katie Schwoyer, Jackie Whitsitt, Ryan Slack, Jen Riffle, Ryan Mahoney, and Jeff Conklin. For the record, if any person who participated in the exec session believes that any substantial discussion of any matters not included in the motion to go into executive session occurred during the exec session, or any improper action occurred during the exec session in violation of the open meetings law, I would ask that you state your concerns for the record.
Hearing none.
Seeing none, the next action item would be a suggested motion to extend the term of the town manager's employment agreement to and through August 13, and to bring back an amendment to that agreement at the August 13 meeting.
As said.
Is there a second? Discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay. Is that it on this deal?
That is it.
Okay, we were in executive session, we're now back in regular session. Is there a motion to adjourn?
Mayor, I move that the town council adjourn the meeting. Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you, everyone, for your
First meeting
wonderfulness.
you've